Hi, and welcome to an episode of the JetRails podcast. I'm Robert Rand, your host, and today we're going to be talking all about PCI compliance. A very fun topic, very energetic. We're going to be touching base, especially around the end of life of Magento 1, around what PCI compliance is, what it means, how it impacts merchants normally, and how it's going to potentially impact merchants after June of 2020 as Magento 1 reaches its end of life with so many thousands upon thousands of Magento 1 sites still live. I'm joined by Joe from the Best Worlds team. And Joe, with no further ado, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. I'm Joe Rollinson. I'm the CEO of Best Worlds. We've been working with Magento since 2009. And this PCI compliance question has come up so many times with our Magento 1 merchants. We still have some Magento 1 people who are facing this decision. So we think there's a lot of important information to get out to the community on this. And we're helping merchants both make their way to other platforms as well as Magento 2, and also try to figure out if there's a way that they can continue to do business and give themselves some breathing room as we approach the end of life of Magento 1 here at the end of June 2020.
Yeah. And one of my favorite questions for guests, whenever there's a company that has an interesting name, I have to ask how Best Worlds got its name. How did that come about?
Yeah, thanks for asking, because I get that question quite a bit. Best Worlds is a nod to our passion for optimization and the search for the best, alternatives among many. The best of both worlds, the best of many worlds. So we're constantly, on the lookout for better ways of doing things, and our name is kind of shows that.
Awesome. All right. So it wasn't just that you were at some shopping plaza with like Best Buy and World of Beer and just, a couple of beers later. No, all right. There's an actual story. I like it. So on the podcast, we have been talking about Magento 1 end of life since pretty much the podcast started. So over a year of this topic coming up, and recently we even had on a guest from Mage 1 talking about security patches. Very interesting for today to be able to talk about PCI compliance more directly and specifically. I know that a lot of agencies, they're putting out a lot of content around Magento 1 end of life that's targeting users getting to Magento 2. What drove you and your team to focus more on helping merchants that won't be migrated before Magento 1 end of life? So not that you're not working Magento 2, but you seem to be out there to help some of these stragglers on M1 a little bit more directly.
Yeah, that's a great question. We were getting our merchant partners. It's one thing to say, are you going to be compliant? Are you not? Are you going to be safe? Are you not? But the question was coming up, well, what's actually going to happen to us if we don't get it done? Like I'd say, you really should do this. You need to pay attention to this. And they'd say, I'd have CEOs or, agency or e-commerce store owners say, okay, but so what? Like what's going to happen to me if I don't? And what I realized is a lot of the kind of the thoughts that are out there in the community are really kind of opinions. But the real people that we needed to ask were people more closely connected to the PCI Council themselves. The payment card industry got together and said, hey, we're taking all this risk. Let's come up with some guidelines so that if people aren't being safe, we can hold them accountable and push the liability down to them, including payment processors and then ultimately merchants. So what the question really comes down to is, what's going to happen to me come July? That question involves the idea of what's going to happen to your compliance status, which if anyone has been doing e-commerce for a while knows that's such a gray area anyway. But in this particular situation, the question comes down to what might happen to you. And there's a couple scenarios we can go through, but the real question is, can I be compliant? And will I be allowed to continue charging credit cards? We think that's the most important topic in this whole conversation. Security, of course, is important and it's in the mix, but the most likely thing you're going to have to address is a payment processor coming to you and saying, hey, you're on end of life. Now what?
Yeah. And I know one of the things that's heated up the topic in recent days was an advisory that came out from Visa that basically, I'm going to paraphrase here. It's available online. We can share the link in the notes, but it said Magento 1 users should be moving to something else, and there is inherent risk. And they basically shared this with the payment processors, with the folks that come next in the food chain through credit card processing. And in some ways, that's Visa's way of saying, in terms of risk, not it. That we've warned you. And so when something does go wrong, now payment processors, you're going to take on more burden here. That's my understanding of the overall way of things. And so that's heated up the conversation. I know, that I've been in touch with a variety of payment processors in the last week or so since that advisory came out. And it's interesting that, some of them are changing some of their direction as a result of that advisory. Some of them are steadfast. I think it really comes down to their customer base and, their interpretations and their feelings on risk for their own organization. Also, who they partner with and, how secure the customers that they work with are able to be, what kind of guidance they're going to get involved in, basically how hands-on or hands-off they're going to be with this. And so I think the chips will continue to move around. It's not just about where they fall, but it's a bit of a moving target as businesses make decisions. But in the midst of all that, there are actual businesses on Magento 1. So, Joe, the merchants that you're actually talking to, your customers and other folks that are in touch with you and your agency, what are they saying to you in terms of why they're still on Magento 1? Is it that they are running behind and they're in some kind of a migration to another platform like M2? Is it that the cost of moving anywhere was too great for them? Is it that they just thought that there wasn't really risk here? What's going on out there in the field that's got us seeing, give or take, from some measures, 100,000 Magento 1 sites still in the wild?
Yeah, we've actually seen a combination of all those things you mentioned. We've seen merchants that said, okay, this is important, started to get the replatforming project looked at and said to themselves, wow, we're not sure we're ready to make this huge commitment either to Magento 2 or to something like a Shopify or BigCommerce. And so we've seen that scenario. We've seen scenarios where I'll say, hey, notice you're on Magento 1. We've been talking to more Magento 1 merchants about this and newer to us as we're kind of reaching out. And I've had some conversations lately where someone said, oh, well, we're happy. We've got all our patches applied. And you say, like, well, do you realize that there are some implications of staying on an end-of-life software, the main one being maybe your payment processor is going to be unhappy about that, and you may have challenges, and a lot of them are just not aware of it. So what the thing that I think is important that to my knowledge, we're the first ones that went out and found a certified assessor, a QSA, is certified by the PCI Council, and said, hey, what do you think about these things? Because one of the things that's happening out there, there's a lot of people talking about magic bullets as we're describing them. Just change this, just apply that, just implement this, and you're good to go. Including, I mean, to be fair, hosting companies that are saying if you just sign up with us, I respect the way JetRails has kind of said there's a suite of things, and most of the hosting companies I think get it, and we work with a handful that we're proud of the way they're dealing with this, but it's still, even in and of itself, none of those things when we talk to this certified assessor were by themselves going to satisfy his perspective as a certified assessor that he would be comfortable passing compliance after June for just a single one of those magic bullets.
Yeah, I'm proud to be at a company that's trying to help merchants and trying to put out good information. I think hosts in general have been put in a position where, we have aggregate, numbers of customers on Magento 1 that, we don't want to see in any sort of a lurch. And so it puts us in a unique position to be able to play a role. We also play a heavy role in overall security, at least, those of us that take that approach. and are able to support on a higher level. I would agree that there's a lot of misinformation out there. There has been. I think in some cases, we all want to believe what we believe, to be true, or we like to simplify things. It's interesting, Mage One, if you were to go through their website, you're not going to see a lot of talk about PCI compliance because you say it's not a magic bullet by itself that's going to get someone through their compliance assessment successfully. And I'd say the same for a lot of other systems, whether it's, hosting your payment processing offsite, so clicking over to another site, the equivalent of, a lot of people are familiar with this with traditional, like, standard PayPal checkout, where you'll go from your Magento checkout page to paypal.com to finish the transaction and then back to some thank you page at Magento. That those sorts of things don't necessarily take away all of the onus from the merchant. You still need a site that's going to be secure so that no one hijacks the checkout process before anyone even gets to that and does something nefarious. So there are all sorts of implications. Are there things that in particular that you've seen that, in essence, that you think maybe there are some merchants out there that already have some bum information that may already think that they're going to be okay when they may wind up, even if they don't have a security issue, perhaps they may have a PCI compliance issue?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the list of these magic bullets, the first one that I hear the most, that I've heard the most, even over the last few years, is, well, hey, I'm using Braintree's hosted fields, or I'm processing payments through PayPal, so I'm out of scope. I've heard that a lot, like, I'm out of scope. And that was an interesting one, in particular in the conversations with John Shin, who's the head of RSI security, and his team has 8 of the. There's only 200 certified assessors in the world, actually certified by the PCI Council, and his firm has 8 of them. So they have a decent voice in the community and host a lot of events related to compliance. But his point was, yeah, you're helping your case, but you're certainly not out of scope just because you have, like, an iframe hosted field or you're doing a redirect. And all you have to do is say, why? Well, it's not too tough if you have access to your website and want to start skimming credit cards, it's not too tough to spoof that same kind of process and make sure that you get the card data. So, it's basically the threshold is reduced a little bit, but it certainly doesn't take you out of scope under the PCI DSS, under the letter of that, document, or in the eyes of, like, an assessor. It's like, yeah, that helps, but you're certainly not out of scope. So that was the first one, is the, like, the Braintree, or like authorized.net, has the authorized.js, I believe it is. That's not authorized. But it's another one of those that has
Acquire, I think, yeah.
What's that?
I think acquire.js, maybe.
Yeah, acquire.js, right. And even Bolt actually enters into that equation. I'm just realizing where, yeah, it helps, but it still doesn't take you out of scope, because all you have to do is say, could a hacker with access to my website still figure out a way to get in the middle? And it's like, absolutely. The other big one is, would a hosting plan on its own just moving to a plan that says, hey, we're safe for you, Magento 1 support. And that was another one where the assessor said, well, that's helpful again, but under the PCI DSS section 6.2 that says you will, and this whole section 6 deals with keeping your software up to date, but 6.2 particularly says that you will apply vendor supplied patches, and with the vendor no longer supplying patches, the hosting situation by itself. Now, I know some of the hosts are going out and trying to work to make sure that they will help provide patches, but I still think that in a Magento world, you need to have your patches applied. So it's kind of like the equivalent of having video camera surveillance on your jewelry store. If no one's watching that or taking action when they see robbers get in, then all you're doing, it's not very helpful to have patches for your store unless someone applies them. So that's another magic bullet that's not really by itself. Being on the hosting plan, it's a very huge help. It's probably the biggest single thing that you can do to prepare, but by itself, it's not enough.
Yeah.
And the last one is this kind of Mage one and Open Mage, and that's one that I think warrants quite a bit of discussion. It's getting a lot, and even there's some stuff going on Twitter this morning as we speak.
It's interesting that you start with Magento 1, which is a very mature platform. The security patches that have come out in recent time, there's not all that much to patch because it's been in the wild a long time, and it's been patched significantly, and there aren't particularly new feature releases. So there aren't changes to the code base that have added in or introduced vulnerability. So you're starting with a pretty popular and well-developed platform that is secure inherently, but that's a moving target. You go and you get patches from, Open Mage is a fork off of Magento 1 that already exists. Mage 1 is prepped in order to take over patches come June of 2020 for users. And so they'll be basically your paid vendor. They won't be the vendor of your Magento software, but they will be a vendor. And I know that's a distinction that even for myself, when I read the PCI requirements, I want to believe that that an assessor is going to see, that you've got a vendor for patches, that that they're running a bug bounty program and they're doing other good things, and that will automatically count. But it sounds like not necessarily. This is going to come down to individual assessors, and whether it's Mage 1 or someone else, they're not particularly the vendor of your Magento platform. And I think Joe, you were alluding to some of that. That's a bit of a sticky wicket.
Yeah, and it certainly helps. I mean, the good news is that at the end of the day, this, John Shin, RSI Security, when we went through and we said, is there a way to be compliant? And the answer was yes. I mean, there's a way to pass compliance now. And so, our message to merchants out there on Magento 1 is that, this is good news, right? But please don't just think that a single magic bullet is going to get you there. And so what we actually worked out with, from his perspective as a certified assessor, we kind of ended up going through and organizing how the things that he would want to see in place. But the biggest takeaway, if you only have 2 words to take away from this conversation about what's going to happen to me if I'm still on Magento 1 past June 2020, the 2 words are compensating controls. So the main thing is just no Magento 1 merchant out there should be saying, if I just check this box, I'm good. They need to realize that it's going to be a conversation. They're not going to most likely be seen as compliant, even if they're on Open Mage and they say, I changed a line of code and now my code base is a different vendor. And maybe an assessor says, okay, who's providing patches? Or maybe they say, well, Mage 1 is providing patches because Mage 1 has signed up to do that, which I think is an amazing offering. In all of these things, you got to think of as ammunition, but it's all in the context of you are not going to meet 6.2 as a requirement. I really believe that we need to get that message out. Even on the Twitter conversations this morning, there seems to be misunderstanding about that. And it's easy to misunderstand, right? It's just a bunch of language in a document. But that's why we went to the source and said, you're certified, you've passed compliance for hundreds of merchants out there, and you're one of the very few that are trusted by the council to give a passing grade to someone. And the answer was, yeah, we have to pass people all the time that can't meet certain requirements. Compensating controls is the mechanism that PCI DSS gives us to say, okay, you couldn't meet this one requirement. What are you going to do to make up for that? And so in conversations, we did come up with, and as part of our thought leadership, but there are 4 things that you can do. And the most important thing is just to get ahead of it, get prepared, and you can get these things in place and you can get yourself some breathing room.
Yeah, I mean, you're mitigating risk. It's a risk analysis. So that's what PCI compliance is all about. It's not that in an automated PCI compliance scan there aren't going to be some false flags or other things going on. It's not that it's at the same time going to necessarily check and catch every single potential vulnerability. It's not necessarily the most in-depth security audit. It's an assessment of your best practice in a more generalized sense that can be applied to a range of different businesses and software and situations. So, that's where, from our team, we've got, content on our site and material out there. We're not trying to necessarily treat this like a huge marketing campaign. But at the same time, we want people to know that if they want assistance, let's have a conversation and let's see what the overall business plan is here. Because we understand that we can cover a ton of this from the hosting perspective by dealing with proactive and reactive security. So the WAF, the intrusion detection systems, and our overall monitoring from our NOC, and we can help make sites 90% more secure than their brethren out there in the wild. But at the same time, you should still be patching. You should be patching within 30 days of a patch being released, as the PCI requirements suggest. There's a lot of, you should be following other best practice for least privileged access and, basic security around your logins and a whole range of other things. And so just trying to have someone sign up for a hosting plan and assuming that by itself is going to get you through PCI compliance or truly keep your site fully secure, I think, it is a form of misinformation itself. We're doing our best to tell our story, that we're here to help merchants, that, for our clients, that we're going to continue to support them, that if someone else needs help, that we're here. Without making it just about sign up for this. and as you say, it's not a magic bullet. And in some cases, we're in touch with a variety of payment processors, and we're trying to make sure that even if one of our clients or someone else comes to us and says, look, I've been in touch with my payment processor, and that's not going to be a good home for me long term. Where else can I go? That we've got some solutions for them. We just don't want to see. There's enough craziness in the world right now. The world is pretty much upside down. Last thing that we want to see is these businesses that are already, in many cases, on some form of shaky ground, having downtime of one sort or another, not able to run credit cards, or dealing with some kind of a security incident that they can't necessarily spring right back from.
And as you're saying that, I do think it would be helpful to go back to the question of what could happen and what's a likely scenario to happen, and then what's a worst case scenario. Because I think oftentimes there's a tension on the worst case scenario, not as much on what's the most likely. So you mentioned, I think all of these security measures talk about, what happens if you're breached. If you're breached come July 2020 and your payment processor becomes aware, it's very likely, just because of the scenario, you could try to convince them that there's other ways, that you're on different packages or whatnot, but it's very likely that payment processor is going to say, until you are off of this end of life software, you can't charge cards anymore. And we actually, it was a whole 2 years ago, we were reached, a merchant reached out to us that had been breached. We're looking for help, and their payment processor at that time had told them, look at this, your software is coming up as end of life. You guys weren't able to keep it safe as you were. We're not even going to talk to you about getting things back going unless you get moved over to Magento 2 in their case. Wow. Which was kind of like, wow, really? This was, and so they were like, yeah, we can't open our store back up until we get it done. So now you've got the shotgun to your head of like, get off of this platform.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you start scrambling to find a high-risk processor that'll hold reserves, that'll hold your cash, that will charge higher fees. But how long can you operate like that? And that's, again, if you find someone reputable that you can work with and that they can work with your business, that's definitely that's a tough scenario.
So it's an ugly scenario, but it's not the most likely. Right? If you've been on Magento 1 for a good amount of time. You're doing the right things. You've been patching. You're already taking your own security measures, like like you said, that a lot of the hosts like JetRail have some good security pieces in place to keep you safe. So it's unlikely that just once the calendar flips over to July 1st, all of a sudden the the skies are going to open up and drop all kinds of vulnerabilities, and you're going to be breached on July 1st. But the more likely scenario is that the approved scanning vendors that your payment processor used to say, and all of us have probably, if you've been doing business online for a while, we've all seen these things that says, hello, this is your payment processor. Our scan has turned up these issues. Please address them and reply, right? It's all like automated.
Mm-hmm.
But what's more likely to happen is that the scanning vendor is going to say, okay, these issues have turned up. Please address them and reply. And one of them is going to be, hey, you're on end of life software, right? And you may reply to that and say, and this is where the magic bullet comes in. You may reply saying, well, we're on a host that's said we're fine, or we're using hosted fields from Braintree, or we're paying Mage1 to supply patches, or we've forked our solution to OpenMage, and now we're not officially on Magento anymore. We're on a completely different vendor. And all of those things are things you can say, but what's quite likely is that those are not going to be all that well understood. And the payment processor is going to say, I don't really think that's the case. Last we knew you were on Magento. And okay, well, what we maybe are going to have to do is involve a security assessor to help with this, because we're not security folks. And so we think the most likely scenario is you're going to have the conversation. And that's the number one thing that I don't think, if I've talked to out of 10 Magento 1 merchants that have said they're not going to be able to get off Magento 1 in time,
yeah,
all 10 of them, I think universally, none of them have really thought through the fact that they're going to probably have to have this conversation. Yeah. And so that's why we wanted to go out and get like some concrete things, what you can do. We've actually produced a checklist. And through these conversations with John Shin, the QSI, we've got 4 things that you can pay attention to. But the idea is, if you get ready for that conversation ahead of time and you arm yourself with some things, you're going to be in a really good position. Probably already you're going to know more than your payment processor. And the likelihood that they'll say, okay, sounds like you've done your homework, sounds like you're keeping things safe, the likelihood is going to go way up if you prepared just a little bit in advance and get the right things lined up.
Yeah. Do you happen to know if someone gets pushed up from the questionnaire to a formal human assessment, what kind of fees or any kind of pain that might come with that merchants should be prepared for? That usually there's some kind of a fee, whether it's charged through, to my memory, the merchant processor, the credit card processor, or directly.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That in conversations with John Shin at RSI Security, he was saying if the payment processor requires you to get a QSA involved, you're looking at typically between 30 and 50 grand to have them, because they basically have to do a full audit, right, and a full assessment. So they have to spend the time to say, okay, what's in your scope? What have you got running? Who's touching the stuff? They have to go through, because they're basically being asked to, assess whether you're safe by the payment processor. So it's a lot of work, and it's high, value work. So it's expensive.
Yeah. And so I guess the alternative that I've come across is perhaps being charged some kind of penalty or fee by the merchant processor if they're willing to still work with you with that in play, or again, finding someone that's willing to take on more risk. And again, perhaps even, at bigger fees or things. There are industries where credit card processing is just more expensive. When you want to sell nutraceuticals or, without a lot of business history behind you to suggest that you're a safe player, things in adult categories, all sorts of things out there, even in some cases travel, because you book a bunch of people for a tour and that tour doesn't happen. And what happens when everybody charges back at the same time, 3 months later or 6 months later, that there are industries that are just considered risky to the credit card industry. So Things exist, but now you're at the mercy of the industry, and you've got to hope that you can make sense of all of it. So I guess no matter what, there's probably some pound of flesh somewhere to be paid if this really comes to fruition. And I'm sure you do not want to fail and have to try to go through the ringer again. That's just going to add to the complexity and the cost of all of this.
Yeah, and the point is, why if this is your business, you should be preparing. And if the worst, I think the worst scenario is that the payment processor realizes that you're kind of bordering on negligent. You thought by the advice of someone, this and that you could kind of have a magic bullet get you out of it. And they're kind of saying like, that's not really enough for us. Maybe there's a chance that they say, well, we're just going to slap you with an extra $50 a month, and on you go, because they'll do that for things like, oh, you're supporting a deprecated version of SSL or something like that. But what we're seeing, and you pointed it out, is we're seeing language come out from the likes of Visa or the likes of very big processors like PayPal, Braintree, that are saying, we know there's a lot of gray area. We want to make sure that it's clear that we don't think that we're going to be very happy about supporting you if you're staying on Magento 1. And it's in a way, it seems a little late. Of course, Magento has come out, quite a while ago, and that for a while they were trying to soft pedal it and stuff, and they finally said, okay, end of June 2020. But the payment processors and the card brands are now, I think we're going to continue to see them come out and say, make no mistake about it, we're not going to be very happy about this, because they just don't really know what that risk entails. So our position is just get ahead of it, do a little homework, check out, posts like ours and like the good content that JetRails is putting out there. But in our case, there's a checklist that we think, at least if you're aware of it, then when the conversation comes up, you can say, we're aware, we've prepared for it, here's what we've done in advance. And it doesn't have to be massive efforts. There's certainly nothing, compared to like a replatform. But we've got these 4 things in place. We actually understand this has come from, advice from a certified assessor. And then you're going to be in a much better position. And so we could probably go through those 4 things. If you're up for that, Robert.
Absolutely. And I do want to add that when we, I've mentioned a few things that come into play with just general Magento security. I believe that most of the things that merchants are supposed to be doing, they should already be doing. They should be doing if they're on Magento 2. They should be doing it if they're on WooCommerce or XCart or PrestaShop or Cilius or Shopware, or I could keep listing software until the cows come home. Drupal Commerce. And it's not so much about the fact that Magento 1 is going end of life, and therefore you need a WAF, or you need, you should have that anyway. But if you're going to stand any chance of staying compliant, I think that's where this really comes in. You should have already had it. You should have it today. But if you're going to try to go up against an assessment without these things, I think it's going to get really complicated really quickly. The same way that I think people should be updating their extensions, and it's just basic math that you don't want outdated software, especially if there are security patches involved. It's best practice. It costs money. It takes time. But that's the nature of running an e-commerce business. If you're running a brick and mortar business, you have other things that you need to change frequently and deal with, and other concerns and other bills that come up. This is certainly the case with e-com. Joe, what would be your highlights of things that people could do in this situation? I know that we've touched on a bunch of different things. And I know that we'll definitely link to that checklist that your team has put together after talking with an actual assessor. But just for those that are along with us listening or watching, what would be those few bullets that you'd make sure that they have in mind as they get themselves ready?
Yeah, so the 4 items are in the context of the compensating controls. You're making up for the fact that you couldn't you're on end of life software. And the four things are additional security, additional scanning, additional monitoring, and additional planning. Those are the four things that we came up with through the guidance of the certified assessor at RSI Security. So when you start to look at those things, you dive in a little deeper, you start to realize that even though we've already talked about no magic bullets, a ton of these things can come into play with the help of your hosting partner, and even with the help of great really appreciate Mage One stepping up to offer patching. But you can see with these four items, we'll go through it, how this means that you need to have all of these things in place. So added security, of course, web application firewall, file integrity monitors, like making sure that you're protecting from people getting into your website. But we feel it's really important that you also say that no one will breach me without me knowing about it. And that involves knowing if a file changes and it wasn't your team changing it, or if there's database activity monitor. Because you can, if you have access to the Magento admin, you can add, in your miscellaneous HTML, or you can add in content. You can get those malicious scripts in there to skim cards that way as well. So we think it's important for you to say, we're protecting people from getting in, lock down your Magento admin, all the things that most likely your host is already recommending that you do. But it's also important that you be able to detect if someone did make it in through some unknown vulnerability or a new vulnerability that's discovered, or that hackers find out there, and then they're able to get in. Because let's face it, they want to skim cards. So to do that, they have to either change a file or they have to change some content in your database. If you're watching all that, then you'll know about it. So added security is where the host can help tremendously. Also, the added scanning. Your payment processor is going to be already having their approved scanning vendor under the PCI, their requirements, because they're required to scan their, merchants. But if you're doing your own scanning, and this is where hosting companies can help tremendously, and you're saying, we're scanning, for example, every month instead of every quarter, we're scanning on our own. So we'll find out about it before you will, if there's a new vulnerability that's found to exist, or there's a new, situation with something that we're running. So adding that scanning is a big help. But again, these are things that they have to have all four in place. The third one being added monitoring. So I mentioned, if you're watching for files changing, if you're watching for database content changing, that monitoring is very important. And it's hopefully triggering alerts. It's ending up in log files that are hopefully getting rotated off websites and things like that. So of course the monitoring is very important too. You're checking who's coming to your site, and you're checking the changes. But those three things, you think about, they're missing something critical. And the metaphor of the surveillance system without a security guard to take action is where the planning, the fourth one's planning, and having that added planning. But in particular, if you have something that says a file has changed, and it's malicious JavaScript. So guess what? Someone's into your site and they're scanning cards. If that email goes out to to someone who's left your company, or to your accountant, that's not really going to do anyone any good, right? So the plan is, who's going to take action? Have we designated someone who will be actively reviewing these things when they come out? Because these things get noisy: file integrity monitor, database activity monitor, and they get noisy because there are changes, and they can be tuned. Ours is tuned specifically to make sure that you're only looking at, you're not looking at places that change all the time in Magento that don't end up having, can host JavaScript files and things. But you have to have someone watching that, and that's the planning.
Well, and that's where a lot of the biggest breaches that we've all heard about in the news have gone awry, because their systems were catching what was going on, but no one was actually looking at the logs or reading the emails, or if they did, they didn't take action. And so, something that could have been mitigated, that was not good, but that they could have cut it off at the pass. It's kind of like, the alarm goes off, the robbers are right there. Well, if the alarm system is calling the police, and the police show up and see the broken window, and they you don't have thieves that can spend all night just emptying out your store. that you might not be in quite the same situation if 2 minutes later they're chased out of there. It's not. The metaphors typically work out pretty well with real world events. For us at JetRails, we have a lot of proprietary technology and a lot of things in our stack. But we took an interesting approach to a lot of this and said, look, this is a moving target, and that's why we've partnered up with Mage One. It's why we partnered up with Cloudflare and Sucuri and Sanguine Security. And basically built, part of our security stack focused on leveraging best-in-class products from others and being very transparent about what we've got, and even in some cases giving merchants choice. So if they want to use a WAF through Section.io, as the overall provider that's going to handle the edge network and CDN and different things that. Absolutely. We're going to tailor around the user, around their needs, around their security apparatus or lack thereof. And we've got a NOC, network operations center that's monitoring these things. So as opposed to expecting the merchant to 24/7 be watching these alerts, as you say, that some of it's just noise. And to be able to identify what's serious and what's not, we're playing a very deep role in that with our clients. To be able to flag as an urgent ticket and reach out manually when something really needs it outside of the normal communications that they may be receiving. So if we've noticed something that we think deserves attention, that we're going to be, out in front of it for them, understanding that on average, our customers don't have that capability. They don't have a 24/7 security operations team to monitor these things in quite the same way that we can. And I think that's also a piece of the puzzle. And it's different than a lot of other hosting solutions out there that may continue to support folks that are on Magento 1 and basically just give them, a hosting account, a server space, and wish them the best of luck. It's a much more proactive security solution than that. And I think that that's part of why we're seeing a lot of folks talk about what we and a few of the other hosts are doing. I think we're all taking different approaches, the way that we're partnering with other companies or doing things internally, the way that we're billing for or not billing and just including in the stack as JetRails does whenever possible. Each one is going to be different. But, I think that anyone that's staying on Magento 1, they need to be in direct contact with their expert Magento developers, teams like Best Worlds. They need to be directly in contact with their web host, and they need a plan. So I think you really did hit the nail on the head. Just having these tools by themselves is not going to protect you. And even outside of a PCI assessment, you don't want to be the website that dealt with some really bad breach or compromise of the site that has to notify customers or lose the ability to run credit cards or anything else, that this is normal risk assessment for a business. Unfortunately, I think it doesn't often get quite enough attention, and there's a lack of understanding in many cases that this is best practice and this is how it should operate. I mean, Joe, I'm guessing that a majority of the merchants that you talk to that are still on Magento 1, that there would be a lot of things we've touched on today that would be news to them. Before you had spoken with them about any of this or
because it's such. Complex, right? And it's PCI compliance always has been. But yeah, the thing that I have a question for you. Like, I think that, is it accurate to say that even if JetRails with advanced detection and things that are trying to keep them safe, still JetRails is not going to be the one who's going to actually take action at the application level, right?
Depending
like apply
on
a patch or try to lock something down when they find that it's been hacked. It's basically like you're going to notify. You're the equivalent of the surveillance system, right? But will you be able to take direct action?
It really depends. So it's a really good question. And I don't want to overstep for our operations team, but in a general sense, so when we see a DDoS attack coming in or some kind of other denial of service, we don't have to wait for somebody. We can start to proactively, block what's obvious bad traffic, or if we see bots or other things that are obvious problems. If we see something that we believe to be for sure problematic, there are steps that we can work on for mitigation. There are things perhaps that we can tune with firewalls or other things, or things that we can start to make copies of and review. And like you say, some of it is assessment, and is notification. We don't always know what's changed in a site, that there may be something going on that we don't know about. And so we have to be very careful about how we walk that line. Last thing that we want to do is make an assumption about what we're seeing when there might be something reasonable or valid happening. We also, I would say, outside of just the knowns and unknowns in situations like the ones that we're describing, you're talking about a security apparatus where there is a development team that's responsible for the Magento code base, for the Magento application itself, installing security patches, updating extensions, working with the client to make sure that they're using secure logins, that they're reviewing who still has access to the admin from whenever that shouldn't have access anymore, and that other things are being done properly. And so, like, if we saw that someone was breaking in through a Magento admin, and for some reason somebody had, we see something, a brute force attack, something that's unusual. Again, we do a lot so that those things aren't happening in the first place, but very specifically, we lock things down in particular ways. But if there's something that we see as a direct vulnerability, we can take certain action. But more often than not, that's not what's happening. And I think that that's a really good point to make, that often, this is about a bit of a trifecta between a client, a merchant, a development team, and a web host. And one by itself, if you're missing one of those three, it falls apart, because the merchant often has to make certain decisions, even if they say, okay, whatever it is that you think is the best thing to do, then do it. They need to authorize. They need to respond to a ticket or do something. In the case of a team like JetRails, at least, in a severe situation, we're going to be calling, reaching out by phone. We're not just going to let something fester. It's a little bit different than a purely automated system. You're dealing with human beings, and we find that the human touch is really what differentiates teams like ours. But you're absolutely right that it's not an all or nothing, and it's not that the one vendor by themselves is going to be able to make all assumptions and protect in real time against everything. And that's part of why whenever we talk about these layers of security, we are always talking about proactive and reactive, that you want to block off as much as you can, cut it off at the pass, lock things down, secure things, firewall things. But you need to know if something has happened so that you can react to it before it turns into something more tragic for the business. So, and at that point, when it comes to that mitigation, there's going to be multiple folks involved. It's not just going to be about us as a web host.
Yeah, like the context of this, especially from the PCI standpoint, is that you're this was actually an important part that came out of the conversation, why a lot of these magic bullets alone are not enough. The assessors are used to seeing breaches, right? And now I remember John Shin was even saying that Verizon came out with a study, a large study of breaches, and I think it was 67% of the breaches were a result of unpatched software. So patching, patch is both a noun and a verb, right? Mm-hmm. But most of the time, the hosts are not in a position to go that far, and they're
no, because if we install a patch and it breaks things in the site, no one is
all
happy.
The extensions you're running and all the go test it on state. And a host can't go invest 20 hours or whatever. Hopefully it's not that much. So the assessors know they just want to know that's going to be a question that's going to come up. Who's responsible for this? And like you said, if it's your development team or you have an IT person, you have an agency, outside agency, great. But if you don't have that fourth piece of the planning, that's part of the planning is like, hey, we can send patches to your email address all day long. Someone actually has to, apply them, test them before they launch them, and in a staging environment, and then get those things live. And similarly, what's going to happen when you find out your file integrity monitor shows you're breached? A host may not be able to start taking action because maybe it involves rolling back code comparing to your code base. So there's always these natural dividing lines between where a host says, I'm sorry, at this point, we didn't build your store. We're hosting it. We've done our best to keep it safe. And now you have to actually take action. Somebody built your store. Either you did it internally, an agency did. You need those guys to go back and clean this up. And, the security guys out there and the certified guys, they know if you don't have someone, if you don't have a plan in place, then that's another little piece of the negligence. It's almost like a microcosm of the whole PCI DSS to begin with, which is they want all these factors.
Yeah,
they want you to try to stay safe, but also to have a plan in case something goes wrong.
It is interesting that, look, part of it, I suppose, not so much, breaches or things, but, just the need for, as a web host, to work with agencies and dev teams. It keeps me, in a job, right? Being in partnerships and helping to foster those relationships and make sure the communications are flowing and best practices are to the best of everyone's ability being adhered to, that we're staying ahead of the curve, that we're listening to what partners like your team are telling us, and that we're all working toward the same end goals, toward success for our mutual clients. I think it's important. We'll often be the ones that are reminding merchants right alongside their developers that it's time to patch something, or that something seems to need some TLC. The other side of it is that there are, patching Magento itself and even patching extensions isn't always enough. So outside of the fact that there are going to be security vulnerabilities that patches may not address, that firewalling and other things may help to address. I don't know, 2019 report from Securi, over 50% of websites hosted, in an environment, like we provide for Magento, were running an outdated version of PHP that was, in some way they're, in an end of life situation. So you're dealing with also, so many folks that aren't upkeeping that hosting layer, and, that are leaving themselves vulnerable. And in terms of PCI scanning and assessment, that again, you're not really going to be better off if, just because you're keeping your application secure, if you're not keeping your server secure, you're right back to square one. So, we have to maintain certain things on our side of the fence in the hosting world. The devs have to maintain certain things in the, in the e-commerce application side. And we have to meet in the middle, because we can't just, let's say, update PHP if Magento isn't compatible with the latest version, if changes need to be made and updates need to be made on the Magento side or whichever other CMS. So I think that's what's often a little bit befuddling to end users, to merchants, that, who do I go to for what, who's responsible for what? And I think it's why companies like ours have been growing in recent years the way that we have, because I think we've figured out that we can solve that need, that's really, really crucial to this process, that otherwise folks are just jumping around a different host every year, because every year they have another support headache or another problem, and they haven't really figured it out, or they're trying one security tool by itself and not getting the full suite, not really in the position that they wanted to see themselves in. And so, you need security experts involved. I think that, if you're just treating your e-commerce site like something that needs to be pretty on the front end, it's like anything else in life. You're taking on risk. All of these different providers that may get in the way of you running credit cards, or may assess you fees, they're all basically looking at this almost like an insurance plan. And are you insurable? Do we want to give your business life insurance, or is the risk that it's going to croak, that it's going to have some kind of security incident very soon just too high and not worth it? So you need folks that are going to help mitigate that are going to stand beside you. And if anything goes wrong, they're going to be there to help assess and address, and even, if you do get audited, that are going to take part in that, and that are going to have the data that you need, and have what you need to get through it with as little pain as possible.
Amen. Yeah, and so even though a host is not a magic bullet, it's probably one of the single biggest pieces that getting in touch with your host, and in particular, if that hosting company like JetRails has done the work to think about what you need to do to be compliant, that's going to be a huge help, and it's not going to be a heavy lift unless you're unless you're not hearing your host talk about this, and then you probably should be talking to a host that's serious about this, because they can knock off a lot of these items, which is probably a good segue into this checklist that we've put together. We really, as a resource for the community, the idea is you can this has all been like in the abstract, but we put together something that we actually think that you could fill in, and you'll be, you may be filling in your host's name next to a lot of these line items. That's the great thing. You'll realize, wow, 70% of these items are taken care of by JetRails. Or, if your existing host has them, or even if you're, hosting your own on, get these things taken care of. And just knowing where those open spots are that you should have on your checklist. But we actually think that this document, if you have it completed, it would be your response. It would be your response to that, notice that comes and says, hey, please address these issues. And one of the boxes that's checked that says you're on end of life software. Say, we understand, we're aware. We know that under the DSS, we need compensating controls, those two magic words. And here's what we've done. Here are the things we've put in place that compensate for the fact that we're on end of life. We're safer probably than 90% of the websites out there. And here's all the things we have put together from guidance by a certified assessor, and we're ready to go. And we think that, replying to that, every assessor is going to be different. Every payment processor needs to make the decision on on their own, because they're underwriting the risk, like you said. But we think that is going to put you in a really good position to have breathing room and to look like a really responsible steward of the fact that you're taking all these credit cards and you're making sure that you're not, siphoning them off to the dark web.
I mean, I guess what's flashing through my mind right now is like, look, I'm sorry, I don't have my driver's license on me, but here's my birth certificate, my social security card. Here's my marriage certificate, a blood test, all my recent utility bills. I've got with me, I mean, whatever you could think of, I'm going to show up with this. And I'm gonna let you know, I've got my Costco card with my picture on it. I've got my credit cards. If I'm not me, then I don't know who is. That this is just your way of saying, look, I know that there's something on the list that you want me to have with me today, but that's not going to be possible. I'm one of tens of thousands of businesses in the same situation, but we're taking care of this so that no one involved is taking on any unnecessary risk. There's no, there shouldn't be this big added burden. Sites can undergo security issues at different times, but, we're going to be more secure than, again, to say 90% of the sites that you see, and we know it, and it's not by accident. We're going to make sure that this is an easy one for you. And I think if you try to go in that way proactively, that that you're in certainly better shape than most, from what folks like Joe and I are running into in the market, it sounds like. Joe, now that you've been, you've spent this time with a PCI assessor, you've been putting together this checklist. Have you been getting any particular feedback from merchants about what you've uncovered and what you've been sharing? And what other folks like us at JetRails, other hosts, other companies like Mage1, et cetera, what others have been sharing. Have you seen that as helpful? Have you seen people's minds changed or their directions changed as a result of the communications that are now really rolling out at a steadier pace?
I have gotten the feedback, both from merchants and from some other partners that have been watching the conversations going on in this, that um, it is refreshing that someone's talking about what real things would actually happen, and someone's actually putting forth a concrete plan that's not just like magic bullet. The other thing that we talked about before, not in this conversation, but that I think is helpful for people to keep in mind, is the idea that this is like you get a traffic ticket, and if you think that there's a vehicle code section that you can kind of skirt, or you can get around it by play on words and things, someone's going to be judging this, right? And a judge may go, baloney, you know what we meant, what we were after. And that's why, kind of, to wrapping some of this up, the magic bullet idea, in the spirit of it, is just not most likely going to be all enough. And then once you become aware of those four things, of the added security, the added scanning, added monitoring, and added planning, you realize that the magic bullets, each of them don't address all four. And so that assessor is going to come in and say, that's cool, but it doesn't check the box. Like you're not, I can't say that you're safe enough yet. And maybe your processor says, I don't feel like you're safe enough yet with what you've described, because the bottom line is you're on this code base that's it's no longer being maintained by the people that created. Even if someone takes it over, are they rewriting all 100,000 lines of code or whatever it is? So keep in mind that this is going to be someone judging your business, your risk. It's going to be a human, and they're not going to understand maybe these little nuances.
Those humans.
The best thing is those darn humans. Yeah, just get yourself ready. Get this checklist in your hand. Get your host lined up. It's not going to be a massive amount of effort to secure things and be ready.
Yeah. And I, from my perspective, I think that you're spot on, that folks can be as prepared as they can be for situations like this. Again, going back to something I said earlier, I think that they should always be following these kinds of best practices, that no one really, none of this matters until you have a problem. And that's the wrong time to be getting set up for best practice once the damage is done. So, and for what it's worth, there are companies like JetRails where, again, we're bringing in other technology. It's not necessarily about increasing profits significantly, or or finding something to sell people, creating some new doodad that we can have some huge margin on or something. It's really about need, and how do we stack that together? And in some cases, we just add things to our stack, and it cuts down our profit margin. Realities set in. Right, that that we know that this is going to be important for users, and so at the end of the day, I think that merchants should be calling around, should be having conversations, perhaps with more than one company, and for sure with their payment processor, with their developers, with their web host, should be feeling good about it, should be going through a checklist like yours, and making sure that all of this is going to come together. And Joe, any final thoughts? And anything else going on in the world before we wrap for today?
I just realized that we to take away an easy to get to URL, bestworlds.com/checklist will get you to our post on it, and at the end of that, you have the access to the checklist. And we think those points are also supporting your overall preparation for that upcoming conversation. So look forward to your feedback on that. But hopefully, people listening to this, merchants, might find that helpful.
Awesome. And Joe, don't be surprised if I quote you on some items in that checklist at some point in the future.
Absolutely.
We do try to work as best as we can with partners when it comes to knowledge and content, and really appreciate you joining today and sharing insights. For our listeners, quick public service announcement that if you know any merchants that are hurting right now, specifically because of what's going on with the coronavirus crisis that the world is facing, we will share a couple of links in the show description and the notes that have to do with organizations like Offline to On to help merchants get online, as well as initiatives that have more to do with supporting merchants that are already up and running and that are just facing an unusual and difficult time. Outside of that, we welcome any feedback and thoughts. You can reach out to us at JetRails across social media. We're on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And certainly welcome you to subscribe and comment wherever you listen to podcasts or wherever you might watch our videos through YouTube or through Facebook, where this is posted in full. And with that, I wish you a lot of success in the coming weeks as we all navigate the world as it is. Health, safety, and and happy selling.